You should never listen to this scary story alone. Welcome back to Creepy Crochet and Creepypasta, let's get into it. There was a hunter in the woods who, after a long day hunting, was in the middle of an immense forest. It was getting dark, and having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of the increasingly oppressive foliage. After what seemed like hours, he came across a cabin in a small clearing. Realizing how dark it had grown, he decided to see if he could stay there for the night. He approached and found the door ajar. Nobody was inside. The hunter flopped down on the single bed, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around, he was surprised to see the walls adorned by many portraits, all painted in incredible detail. Without exception, they appeared to be staring down at him, their features twisted into looks of hatred. Staring back, he grew increasingly uncomfortable. Making a concerted effort to ignore the many hateful faces, he turned to face the wall, and, exhausted, he fell into a restless sleep. Face down in an unfamiliar bed, he turned blinking in unexpected sunlight the next morning. Looking up, he discovered that the cabin had no portraits, only windows. It was late summer, and I was having a week-long sleepover at my ex's house. Later that night, we were bored and decided to go outside into their yard. It was around 10:30 p.m. and it was pitch black. The only light we had were our phone flashlights, which barely helped. When we were about halfway into the yard, they suddenly tapped me on the shoulder. "Hey, do you see that? That white thing on the top of the hill?" I looked, and I saw it. There was a human-shaped figure, glowing white. The second I made eye contact with it, my gut told me to run. I stared for maybe 2 seconds, and then I booked it. My ex ran with me. We got back inside and sat in their room, trying to figure out what we just saw. Eventually, we decided to look again. We opened the blinds, and it was closer. Before, it had been on a hill about 40 feet away. Now it was only about 10 feet from the house, just standing there facing the door. It saw us. We ran back to the room, terrified. Around 11:30, we looked again. This time, it was moving. It was in this weird pose, like when you're tiptoeing and trying to keep your balance, arms and legs spread out, but it was doing that while sprinting and leaping. I started having a panic attack. After I calmed down, we tried to figure out why this thing was even there. And then I remembered something. Earlier that day, we had been using a ghost app. It's one of those apps where you talk and it gives you responses. And one of the things it told us was to go outside. And we did. We didn't look again until around 2 a.m. When we did, it was back on the hill where we first saw it. So we thought maybe it wouldn't move again. The next day, nothing really happened. So later, around dusk, we decided to go outside again. We walked closer to the hill. Behind it, there's a section of forest. For just a split second, we both saw a glowing white figure move behind the trees. We ran. Again. Later, we went back out, but this time we brought the dogs. And these dogs are not small. They could seriously hurt someone if they needed to. We were watching the trees where we last saw it, but the dogs weren't looking there. They were staring toward the farm off to the left, a completely different direction, and for some reason, we ignored that. That night, when it got dark, we looked again. This time, we followed where the dogs had been looking, toward the farm, and I saw it. At first, it looked like a sheep, but they don't even have sheep. Then it stood up, dropped to all fours, stood up again, then bent backwards and ran toward us before disappearing. We didn't look again until around 3 or 4 in the morning. When we did, it was standing upright again. Its limbs were way too long. It walked behind a tree. When it came out the other side, it had changed. Now it looked like a goat. Half white, half brown, perfectly split down the middle. They don't have a goat like that either. That was the last day I stayed there. They told me they've never seen it again. We think I have an attachment with that thing, but you never know. This scary story honestly messed me up for days the first time I read it. Welcome back to Creepy Crochet and Creepypasta. Let's get into The Smiling Man. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. Guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to see where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him. He took giant, exaggerated tiptoed steps as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the fuck do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the fuck? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore. Nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way. And this time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off at the side of the road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk, he didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane, and that's a very, very scary thing to see. Something would mimic my mother's voice from outside my window. In bed last night, I was on the edge of sleep, that sweet spot where you're half in reality and half in dreamland. But then, a sound as clear as day pierced the silence. My mom's voice. What freaked me out was that the sound wasn't coming from her bedroom, the hallway, or even anywhere inside the house. It was right outside my window, clear and unmistakably her. Every muscle in my body went rigid. 1,000 thoughts crashed into my head all at once, each more terrifying than the last. The idea of pulling back those curtains made my heart race, because what if something was waiting there, staring back? "James, open the window." It was her voice, but something about it just felt off. It sounded so much like my mom, but there was an unsettling edge to it, and why the hell would she be outside calling me through the window? None of this added up. Every ounce of me was locked in terror. The thought of sleep felt impossible. I buried myself deep beneath the blankets, praying that whatever it was would just stop. But as the night dragged on and the voice went quiet, pure fatigue took its toll. Maybe it was the fear, but eventually I passed out. Waking up the next morning, the first thing on my mind was telling my mom about last night. Walking downstairs, there she was, just like any other day, making breakfast like nothing ever happened. "Mom, did you call out to me from inside my window last night?" She looked confused. "Why would I be outside your window? You must have dreamt it. I could have sworn I heard your voice." She chuckled lightly. Dreams can be deceiving at times. Maybe it was just a vivid nightmare. I hesitated, still trying to piece together the fragments of that night. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was a dream that felt real. After a while, I managed to convince myself that it was just a dream, a means for my mind to cope with the unnerving feeling. Days went on, and for a while everything seemed normal. I hadn't heard my mother's voice from my window for a few days. But that illusion of safety was shattered just 15 minutes ago. I kissed my mom goodnight, as was our nightly ritual. Settling into bed, it didn't take long before the familiarity of her voice reached my ears again. Again, it emanated from outside my window. There was no passing this off as just a bad dream. I hadn't even shut my eyes. "Open your window, James. Let mommy in." The voice seemed somewhat angry this time, yet it still mirrored my mom's tone. My heart raced, cold dread washing over me. My immediate instinct was to flee my mom's room and alert her to the unsettling voice. But curiosity, as treacherous as it often is, especially as a child, anchored me in place. I needed to know what was really calling me. With trepidation, I approached the window, praying that the voice would remain silent. Stealthily, I peeked through a tiny gap in the curtain, ensuring I remained unnoticed. The sight that met my eyes was both terrifying and confusing. It was a deer, hunched over on its hind legs with its front 2 legs pressed up against my window. Its legs were grotesquely elongated, making it tower unnaturally on its hind limbs. Its eyes locked onto the interior of my room with an unsettling intelligence. It just stood there, waiting, as if expecting me to comply with its request. "Fuck that!" I shouted. I sprinted to my mom's room, screaming what I had just witnessed. She jolted awake, her eyes wide with alarm and confusion. When I told her about the deer, she seemed even more confused. It made no sense. We didn't even have deer in our area. Rubbing her eyes, she made her way to my room and slowly pulled back the curtain. To my dismay and her skepticism, the window revealed nothing. The deer was nowhere in sight. She thought I was playing a prank on her, but I assured her I wasn't. I could understand her skepticism. After all, a deer outside your window calling your name is absurd to even think about. Yet what I witnessed was undeniably real, and undeniably my mother's voice. There is no way in hell I'm ever going to sleep in that room again. This scary story will have you never wanting to stay in a hotel again. A man goes to an old hotel. He gets his keys from the reception and heads off to his room. As he walks down a hall to his room, he hears crying coming from behind one of the doors in the corridor. He stops at the door that the crying is coming from and looks through the keyhole. A woman in black with wrinkled hands, covered in liver spots, and her face covered by a veil, is sitting on a stool in the corner of the room, sobbing. The man asks if she needs help. She doesn't answer. He asks again, and the reply continues to be nothing but crying. The man decides that he's too tired to help and continues to his room. The next morning, as he's walking down the same hall to go to the reception, he remembers the old woman. He goes to her door and hears silence. He peeks through the keyhole and sees nothing but red. The man gives up and goes to the reception to check out. As he's leaving, he mentions the crying woman in the room to the receptionist. The receptionist turns pale and says that that room is said to be haunted by an old woman. The man laughs it off and heads to the door. He stopped in his tracks when the receptionist says, "The ghost is an old woman with red eyes."